Welcome to the Wellness Rebel Show, where you reclaim your health and tap into your body's healing power. I'm your host, Fatima, here to empower you with the knowledge and tools to take charge of your well-being. Whether you want to boost energy, improve mindset, or unlock vitality, this is your go-to source for practical advice and inspiration. It's time to step into your power and live a life of health and freedom. Welcome to the revolution. Welcome back to the Wellness Rebel Show. Today I have Dr. Rick Malter, author of Strands of Health, and he's one of my, I wouldn't say mentor, but he's one of the men that I follow regarding mineral balancing. And he's here to talk all about that and copper and whatever else comes into conversation. Welcome, Dr. Rick.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I always enjoy being on a person's podcast. I love talking about minerals in general and the hair analysis in particular, because 44 years ago, when my health was in terrible shape, the hair analysis was the only test that showed how critically deficient I was in magnesium.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine who happened to be a Ph.D. educator working with kids who had learning disabilities and ADD, he was already using hair analysis to help these kids. And he saw what terrible shape I was in. And so he urged me to get my own hair analysis. And when he got the results back, as he's looking at the results, he puts his thumb and forefinger close together like that and tells me that the results indicate that I am that close to a heart attack. Yeah. How did he know that? Because my magnesium level was 90% too low. And he knew the research that was already done in the 1970s and early 90s by a medical doctor, a brilliant doctor, Mildred Seelig, Seelig, MD, and she had studied the relationship between stress, magnesium deficiency, and sudden massive fatal heart attacks. Mm-hmm. So this was all known 15 or more years ago.
Yeah.
And so this friend of mine literally saved my life and restored my health 44 years ago when I was 43 years old. And that's why I'm still here to talk to you. There is no doubt in my mind that without that first hair analysis, that was the only lab test that detected how critically low my magnesium level was, I wouldn't be here.
Yeah.
So he certainly got my attention. And then he gave me some things to read about it in the early days of the early 1980s. And I got very interested. And I began to fly down from Chicago, where I had my home and my psychology practice in the Chicago suburbs. I would fly down to Phoenix, Arizona, to attend the seminars that were given by the two men who pioneered the research into hair analysis, the late Dr. Paul Eck and Dr. David Watts. Mm-hmm. Together, beginning around 1975, they started to look intensively at hair analysis results of many different people and relating these results to people's problems with a slow thyroid, with and burnout, chronic fatigue, problems with glucose regulation, heart function. And it turns out that they found that the minerals are the primary spark plugs of life. Another medical doctor, Henry Schroeder, described the minerals as the spark plugs of life. He had seen that in his patients, and he realized how vitally important they were. And that strongly influenced his medical practice and his research. So those were a couple of the major medical doctors. just 40, 50, 60 years ago who were aware of how important the minerals were. And then another MD who was also a Ph.D., Carl Pfeiffer,
Mm-hmm.
Pfeiffer, he established his Brain Biocenter in Princeton, New Jersey. And he began to notice among some of his female patients that some of them presenting schizophrenia or psychosis and other emotional problems had been on the female birth control pill, which made them copper toxic.
Mm-hmm.
And he recognized that connection and realized that the birth control pill was making some teenage girls and young women schizophrenics, as their copper levels build up to an excess and loaded the excess copper in the brain and in the liver. So they began to have all kinds of physical as well as psychological problems, which Dr. Pfeiffer wrote about in his book, Mental and Elemental Nutrients, that he published in 1975. And in his book, Dr. Pfeiffer had a whole chapter on copper toxicity. And since that time, the copper toxic problems have gotten worse and worse and worse as teenage girls and women continue to use the birth control pill and or a copper IUD, which also makes them copper toxic. So Dr. Watts, who was one of the pioneers in hair analysis, established this trace element lab, which has been in the Dallas area for more than 3 decades. And he was telling me that 80% of the hair samples submitted to his lab produce mineral patterns relating to slow metabolism,
Mm-hmm.
or slow oxidation is another synonymous term, and copper toxicity. And this led me to conclude that we're experiencing and have been experiencing an epidemic of copper toxicity, which is so little understood by the general public, certainly by the female population.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, virtually all healthcare professionals are totally unaware of the copper toxicity problem underlying many of the health issues presented to them by their patients or clients.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they're just throwing out diagnostic guesses without adequate lab data. And over the years, going to the seminars in Phoenix and learning more and more about hair analysis, it made sense to me that there was a psychological component to the mineral system as it's reflected in hair analysis, because these minerals are closely related to the stress response, which is really our survival mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
The stress response links the mind and body in one unified system. Early in my college years, studying psychology at the University of Chicago, the emphasis in the 50s and 60s of the last century was on Freudian psychology. And so many of us students and the faculty assumed that psychological issues were from the chin up. We didn't observe and notice that just about every body walking around the university campus had a head attached to it.
Yeah. So
So
let's.
learning about hair analysis, I was able to realize I better pay attention to what's going on in a person's body nutritionally and mineral-wise if I really want to understand what's happening up here in the head and the brain.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
Because.
the stress response, as it's reflected in different minerals in the hair analysis, really shows us that the hair analysis is both a physiological test related to medical issues, but it's also a psychological test because stress involves the fight or flight response. Fight is anger and rage. Flight is anxiety and panic.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty simple and straightforward. You don't need a big, thick psychiatric diagnostic manual, which the psychiatrists have managed to invent and fabricate over 300 diagnoses of mental illnesses. They just make them up.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the big pharma companies have a new drug for each new mental illness that the psychiatrists make up. There's a brilliant British psychologist who was very interested in how the psychiatrists came up with not only dozens of new mental illnesses, but literally hundreds.
Yeah.
So he did some research interviewing the primary psychiatrists who committees around the table, and they would discuss symptoms of their patients. And then they would assign a mental illness diagnosis depending on what the symptoms were that they were discussing. Especially starting in 1980, they kept expanding their diagnostic manual from a relatively small book, got bigger and bigger and bigger
Mm-hmm.
as they added dozens and even hundreds of mental illnesses, most of which are all fabrications of psychiatrists' minds.
Yeah. It's
And then
basically
they would vote.
labeling. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so they're very good at labeling, not very good at understanding the underlying copper toxicity and mineral deficiencies
Mm-hmm.
and mineral effects on the brain and nervous system.
Yeah.
So this
So,
British psychiatrist, his name is Dr. James Davis, Davies, and on YouTube he's got a couple of excellent lectures summarizing his research, talking to the psychiatrists who admitted they have no research basis for virtually any of their fabricated mental illnesses. And they have no lab tests, but they've been able to convince the public and politicians and the legal system that they are the leaders in the mental health field. And for
yeah.
this reason, I don't like the term mental health or mental illness because it's a natural lead in to psychiatry and their fabricated diagnoses. I much prefer to talk about the minerals and especially stress and toxic metals in general, like mercury, lead, cadmium, aluminum, and so on, that affect the brain and nervous system, and the copper toxicity and the stress patterns and energy and fatigue patterns that show in a hair analysis.
Yeah. So I would assume that it's mostly women that would be very copper toxic, but I
Yeah,
know there's also other, sources of copper toxicity that even males would get exposed to. So
yeah.
what are some of these sources aside from the birth control and the copper IUD that can cause copper toxicity?
Well, copper plumbing, especially if you have softened acidic water that will leach copper
Mm-hmm.
from the plumbing into the water, that was a major source. Copper sulfate is sprayed on different food crops, and that's another source. And one of my students, a man by the name of Rick Fisher up in
Mm-hmm.
Vancouver, Canada, realized the importance of copper toxicity, and he did extensive research, and he built an excellent website, which is coppertoxic.com. And so he's got a wealth of information about the buildup of copper toxicity. And just recently, he published a book which is based on what he compiled from his website. So in a book form, he's got an index and table of contents, and it's easy to pick out different aspects of copper toxicity from the book.
Yeah.
So he has really made himself an expert on copper toxicity. And the case studies that he cites on the website and in his book are just very, very sad and tragic. The way the buildup of copper toxicity in some women has just utterly destroyed their health and their lives, both mentally and physically. And the copper toxicity, in the way it affects the overall mineral system, makes them highly reactive to stress,
Mm-hmm.
the fight or flight response, the anger and anxiety, and that results in them experiencing problems controlling their emotions, which then affects them psychologically, behaviorally, emotionally, and in the way they function. And it winds up destroying their relationships.
How about it also affects fertility, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, because the intention was to serve as a contraceptive, blocking fertility,
Mm-hmm.
blocking conception. And
Yeah.
then when many of these women wanted to get pregnant, they couldn't. They had fertility problems. And that's why fertility clinics have appeared all over.
Yeah. It's big
It's a
business
whole,
for
it's a whole
sure.
new field of medical specialty.
Yeah. Yeah. Now let's touch on, I know this is kind of controversial, like ADD/ADHD and copper connection.
Well, I first encountered this connection back in 1983, shortly after I learned more about hair analysis from these seminars in Phoenix and incorporated hair analysis into my psychology practice. So in 1983, a young mother brings her 9-year-old boy in to see me because the school was pushing her to medicate him. He was extremely hyperactive. At that time, I was using a behavior rating scale that ran from 1 to 36, with 36 being the most extreme ADHD, hyperactivity. And the mother rated her son 36 out of 36.
Wow.
So we got a hair analysis on him. I did some other psychological and educational testing, and turned out that he had what a speech therapist friend and colleague of mine and I call auditory memory and processing problems. And it turns out copper toxicity in the brain will tend to produce these kinds of auditory memory and processing problems. Some people would call these learning disabilities. Other people label them as ADD or ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
So he showed signs of being a very, very intelligent boy, but with auditory memory and processing problems. And my speech therapist colleague specialized in helping kids with those problems. And so I referred the boy to work with my speech therapist colleague. And then over the next 3 months, he was taking supplements. And then the mother brought him in to see me after 3 months for a retest of the hair analysis. And his first hair analysis showed an extremely low copper level of
Mm-hmm.
0.8. The ideal hair copper was designated at 2.5, so it was obviously very low. When we retested him, his mineral pattern shifted from a fast metabolic type pattern with low calcium and magnesium high sodium. And on the retest, the mineral pattern shifted dramatically. The calcium and magnesium became highly elevated. Sodium and potassium dropped. But what was astonishing was his copper level jumped from zero point 0.8 to 24.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Doctors Eck and Watts called a copper dump from cells or a
Yeah.
copper detox. And so that was a huge detox that he had gone through during the 3 months being on the right supplements. And the mother rated him again on the rating scale, and the rating dropped from 36 down to about 24 or 25, with a dramatic drop in the intensity of his ADHD symptoms.
Uh-huh.
And when I was talking with him, one of the things we talked about was how he handled situations where adults would say, if you do this, then this will be the consequence. As long as he was so copper toxic and so out of balance with his minerals and so ADHD, he could not comprehend and apply if then consequences. With the copper detox and reducing his ADHD tendencies, he now understood and could apply, if you do this, then these will be the consequences. So that was one of the most dramatic cases.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I was beginning to see uh, adult women with copper toxicity, and his mother was one of them. And so what we began to realize, and Doctors Eck and Watts realized, is that when a teenage girl or a young woman is very copper toxic, during the stress of a pregnancy, some of her excess copper gets stirred up,
Mm-hmm.
released from the cells to be excreted. But while it's circulating to be excreted, it can go into the fetus
Yeah.
via the placenta. And that's how many younger males over the last 40 or 50 years have become copper toxic.
Now, would you say that usually it's the firstborn that will have that um, kind of like that huge burden of the copper toxicity from the mom and it lessens as there's more kids, or will it be kind of the same? Or
I think it's more a function of the stress of a particular pregnancy
okay.
rather than the sequence
Mm,
of the pregnancies.
okay. So is it the more stress, if the more stressful the pregnancy was or is, the more copper toxic the child possibly will be?
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh, so not only do some babies absorb much more copper than other babies,
Mm-hmm.
but one of my clients, when he was talking about how angry his mother was talking about being marinated in her adrenaline from her anger.
Wow. Yeah.
That was a profound observation this gentleman made. I think there's a lot of clinical significance to that because when a mother is extremely stressed, it can have a profound influence on how her baby is going to respond to stresses, whether it's anger and rage or anxiety and panic.
Mm.
Because I think what happens during the pregnancy and exposure to the mother's stress hormones in utero is it primes the baby's system to be super reactive to stress later in life. Another good example, uh, at our clinic, we were working with a couple who had a lot of problems in their relationships with their kids and with themselves. And the mother had an extreme anxiety condition.
Mm.
And we did a hair analysis on her. We got her on magnesium and other anti-stress supplements with very little effect. Now, she happened to have a wonderful British accent. And it occurred to me to ask her, when was she born? She was born in September 1940. Why is that significant? Well, we know that during 1940, that was the start of World War II, and London was being bombed on a nightly basis. So can you imagine a woman being pregnant during the summer of 1940?
Yeah, yeah,
And so that's why it's important to know the history of each person with whom we're dealing uh, with their hair analysis results.
yeah. I know, because it really goes. A lot of people don't realize that what we are experiencing right now can be from even when we were still in utero and when we were born.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not happy with some of the apps that are being promoted to help newcomers doing hair analysis work think that they can understand the person's hair analysis and the influences on the hair analysis mineral pattern without actually spending time talking with the person.
Yeah, yeah. So it has to be a combination of like the health, the history of the person with their symptoms, and then the hair test.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. So I know that you were a psychiatrist, right?
No, a
Or
psychologist.
okay, but you used
Psychiatrists have MD degrees and prescription pads, and they write
yeah,
prescriptions for toxic psychiatric drugs.
right. But you used hair tissue analysis on your patients
Yep,
and help them get better that way.
right.
Yeah.
Because the hair analysis gives me a lot of good information about the presence or absence of toxic metals,
Mhm.
especially copper toxicity, critical mineral deficiencies like with magnesium or potassium, mineral imbalances in the ratios between minerals like sodium and potassium relates to stress.
Yeah.
The higher the sodium is exceeding potassium, the more intense a person's stress response will be. So that throws them into fight or flight, becoming very moody, having difficulty with emotional and behavioral control because of the stress. And the extreme form of stress is what I call stress overwhelm. And because stress is a reflex survival mechanism, it doesn't matter how high a person's IQ is, how much education they have, how many degrees, how many licenses or certificates or whatever. If they've got an extreme stress pattern in the hair analysis, they're going to be emotionally and behaviorally out of control.
Yeah. Yeah. They're going to be very reactive.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that goes on is that if some people become extremely violent
Mhm.
and get into legal problems, Some courtroom judges may order these individuals to take classes in anger management. Well, you can talk to you blue in the face, but if the person's got a critically high sodium, a severe magnesium deficiency, and a severe potassium deficiency, no amount of anger management classes is going to really bring that under control.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's the
So,
limitation of people's understanding of, or lack of understanding of the mineral system, including professionals, which is
mhm.
really sad.
Yeah. Yeah. We see a lot of people just throw supplement recommendations without thinking about the delicate mineral system. That's for sure.
Yeah, well, Dr. Eck, 45 years ago, in his seminars, used to talk about the guesswork going on even in the nutrition field
Mhm.
without the hair analysis data.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the reality is that the hair analysis is a primary lab test with tremendous accuracy when it's properly cut from the scalp. In the last couple of weeks, I've seen a couple of hair analyses that were based on pubic hair samples.
Mhm.
The pubic hair doesn't get exposed to the minerals in the bloodstream in the same way that the scalp hair does.
Okay.
So there are minerals that accumulate in the pubic hair that the labs can analyze because there's minerals that are there to be analyzed, but they don't mean the same as scalp hair. So I
Yeah.
urge my clients, don't waste your money on pubic hair samples, or in the case of men, chest hair or other body hair. Even if they're bald, it's better to wait till the scalp hair grows out and get a proper scalp sample. Or for women who color their hair,
Mhm.
I would rather they submit a hair sample that has some hair color in it than a pubic sample.
Yeah.
But
How about
if we
Go
do
ahead.
have a properly cut scalp hair sample, the labs do a great job in analyzing that mineral content and reporting the results.
Yeah. How about in the case of, does like water having water softeners really affect the readings of the minerals in the hair?
Yeah,
Yeah.
most water softeners are softened using sodium salts.
Mhm.
Okay. Years ago, I had a client who had an unusually high potassium level. And I couldn't figure out initially why she was showing so much potassium. It turns out that her water softener was using a potassium salt.
Mhm.
And as soon as she changed the salt she was using in the water softener, and we retested her hair analysis, bingo, her potassium level dropped way, way down.
Yeah. Yeah. How
So
about, I know
we know
other
that there are other possible sources of contamination. Okay, go ahead.
Mhm. I know that they say to the labs, if you have a water softener, to rinse your hair with distilled water. Does that help?
It depends on the person and how much of the softened water they're exposed to.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's why it's important to follow up the hair analysis with the interview with the person to find out what they're experiencing and what kind of water softener they may be using or hair color
Yeah.
and other contaminants. So, for example, if we see a very high selenium level, invariably they're using a dandruff shampoo like
Yeah.
Selsun Blue. So right away I know that's a contamination of the selenium reading.
Yeah.
But the rest of the hair analysis is usually quite accurate and valid. Same thing with a high zinc with Head and Shoulders shampoo.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so we know there are a few shampoos that have very distinctive effects. So we simply recognize certain minerals will be contaminated,
Mm-hmm.
but we can still derive a great deal of information about their overall mineral system and the dynamics of the mineral system.
Yeah. How about I know that the labs also recommend sending in freshly washed hair because they say that this if you have been sweating that will also affect the sodium levels. Is that very important to like remember, or it's not real, it doesn't
Certainly
really
important
skew?
to recognize that possibility, but in talking with the person, you can get a pretty good idea of what their stress condition is,
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah.
which will be impacting their sodium level.
Yeah. Okay. So, is it right like when the initial stress stage, the body burns through sodium and potassium, so usually you'll see really high readings of them because they're getting released, they're getting excreted by the kidneys, or what are usually the first like the main minerals that are getting um getting burned through when you're very stressed?
Now, magnesium is the primary one.
Okay.
Magnesium is nature's anti-stress mineral because of its effect on the brain and nervous system and the endocrine glands, especially the adrenal glands. And so, with intense stress, magnesium deficiency is very common.
Okay.
But there are two ways that the magnesium deficiency appears in a hair analysis. One is an absolute low magnesium,
Mhm.
and usually a high calcium to magnesium ratio.
Okay.
But the other can be a low calcium magnesium ratio with what appears to be a high magnesium. Well, if a person truly had an excess of magnesium in their system that was producing a high magnesium in the hair analysis, since magnesium is a muscle relaxant, then you would expect that the person would be experiencing very flaccid muscles.
Yeah.
Invariably, when there's a high magnesium, especially with a high sodium potassium stress ratio, the calcium magnesium ratio is low, but they have spastic tight muscles.
Yeah.
So that confirms they're losing a heavy amount of magnesium and they're magnesium deficient.
Yeah.
I remember when I was starting out with hair analysis in the mid 1980s, and I was dependent on consultations from the lab in Phoenix to guide me in figuring out and recommending a supplement protocol. This one young woman happened to be very, very copper toxic, and she had a very high sodium potassium stress ratio.
Mhm.
And she had a low ratio of calcium to magnesium. So even though her calcium was high in the hair analysis, the magnesium was even higher.
Yeah.
And the recommendation I got from the lab was because the calcium was lower than magnesium to put her on calcium and not magnesium, even though she had indications of high stress and magnesium loss.
Yeah.
So I followed the lab's recommendation. She started on supplements, including calcium. A couple of days later, I get an urgent call from her that her muscles, especially in her feet, were extremely painful from spasms. and her toes were curling under.
Mm-hmm.
And she was a brilliant young woman. And as we talked, we both figured, hey, she's losing magnesium and is really magnesium deficient and not calcium deficient.
Yeah.
So she stopped the calcium supplementation and started taking magnesium, and the tight spasm in the feet and other muscles released.
Mm-hmm.
And that together with Dr. Watts's observation that there's a potassium loss with a copper detox or a copper dump.
Yeah.
And uh, what complicates many hair analyses is when the two critical intracellular minerals, namely potassium and magnesium, are lost in large quantities. Depending on the timing of cutting your hair sample, they may temporarily appear elevated when in fact they're being lost from the cells and the cells are metabolically experiencing deficiencies of magnesium and or potassium. So that affects the accuracy of hair analysis results to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
When key minerals are being lost, like magnesium and potassium. But when we understand that dynamic, we can still come up with good supplement recommendations.
Yeah. Now, what would you say to the naysayers? Because, a lot of people, when we mention hair tissue mineral analysis tests, there's some people who are like, oh, my naturopath said that those things are not accurate and they've been, how do you say that? They've been debunked or whatever as being like a useful screening tool. What would you
Yeah, well,
say?
well, you got to know the history
Yeah.
of the AMA's role in debunking hair analysis. So in the early to mid 1980s, after Dr. Watts and Dr. Eck made their breakthrough in their hair analysis research and were giving these seminars in Phoenix, they'd be drawing 50 to 100 people on a weekend to learn from them about minerals in general and hair analysis. So there was more and more interest in this new test and test interpretation. So by 1985, the trend of greater and greater interest in hair analysis was really becoming apparent. So I was already using hair analysis for a couple of years in my psychology practice. So one morning in August of 1985, I get a call from one of my clients asking me if I had read the article in the newspaper about hair analysis. So I got a copy of the newspaper, read the article, and the conclusions and description of hair analysis in the article ran totally counter to what I had learned from Drs. Eck and Watts in their seminars and what I was experiencing with myself, my family, and friends, and my clients. So I went over to the local hospital medical library to get out the August 1985 issue of JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. And they had published an article claiming that hair analysis was not accurate and it was a scam. It labeled hair analysis, it described hair analysis as commercial hair analysis, as if big pharma is not commercial.
Yeah.
Yeah. but they called hair analysis commercial. So I read the article. It was by Dr. Stephen Barrett. And Barrett was a self-appointed quackbuster. He was attacking chiropractic, naturopaths, acupuncture, nutrition, anything except big pharma.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was a self-appointed quackbuster. And so his latest thing to attack was hair analysis. So what did he do? He cut shoulder-length hair samples from two 17-year-old girls. I guess one of them was his daughter and the other was a girlfriend. So I guess he offered them a haircut.
Yeah.
So you can imagine, shoulder-length hair would be running at least 5 to 6 inches long, and then he cut it into one-inch segments, mixed them all together, assuming that the proximal hair, the first inch from the scalp, would have identical mineral patterns to the distal hair, which was at the shoulder level.
Yeah.
And then I understand he washed the hair samples in tap water from his kitchen sink. So he sent them off to 13 different labs, and they came back with some variation in test results with that methodology. And he concluded hair analysis is not accurate.
Mm.
And JAMA was more than happy to publish it, putting out press releases, and it got all over the news. I don't know if you remember Ted Koppel's Nightline TV show. Ted Koppel was a TV journalist, and he had an evening news show interviewing different people about different topics in the news. So he had Barrett on. And so he gave Barrett exposure to his very wide audience on ABC. And that article in JAMA serves to warn doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, and any health practitioners to stay away from hair analysis. And the public.
Yeah.
It was a classic gaslighting of hair analysis. And then they repeated that again in January of 2001 when a group of people from the California Health Department wrote an article again attacking the accuracy of hair analysis. There were 4 authors from that California group. So I guess one of the women volunteered her hair. So based on hair samples from one woman, they again concluded that the hair analysis is not accurate and it's a scam, and that they had proved that Barrett's 1985 article was correct. So I wrote a rebuttal article to that January 2001 JAMA article, and I got my article published by Dr. Abram Hoffer in his Journal of Molecular Medicine. And in that article, I was able to pull out the actual numbers of the hair analysis results from the 2 major labs that I use, the ARL lab in Phoenix and the Trace Element lab in Dallas. And when you pair the numbers from each of these 2 labs for all the nutrient minerals, they're virtually identical.
Mm-hmm.
But the authors of that article didn't use the actual numbers to conclude that hair analysis is not accurate. They used terms like whether a mineral was high, average, or low.
Yeah.
High, average, and low are interpretations of data. They had the actual numbers, which really reflect the accuracy of the lab testing. Fortunately, they did report the numbers, but they didn't use those in their analysis, which is what I pointed out. So, unbeknownst to them, they actually got data that showed hair analysis truly is highly accurate.
Yeah.
But that wasn't the AMA's agenda or the author's agenda. And again, there was another gaslighting attempt.
Now, do you ever use any other, like let's say a blood test or something like that in conjunction with a hair test, or do you just?
Well, for most of my clients, the hair test is sufficient
Mm-hmm.
for what I'm looking at and trying to accomplish.
Yeah. Yeah.
And even if you have blood tests, a lot of times they're not going to be as valid relating to the person's symptoms and health issues. But getting back to the August 1985 JAMA article by the quackbuster in chief, Dr. Barrett, turned out when I looked closely at the data in his article on these two girls, they had high calcium, low to average potassium, and obviously a high calcium potassium ratio. And they both had high copper.
Mm-hmm.
Surprisingly, two 17-year-old girls with high estrogens were already copper toxic. And of course, Barrett had no clue what that meant.
Yeah.
But that wasn't of interest to him or the editors of JAMA. And that's why hair analysis has not been widely accepted and utilized because of what I call junk science
Yeah.
and gaslighting. And you wonder how many people may have died prematurely from preventable heart attacks if they had used hair analysis like I did and detected a critically low magnesium.
Yeah.
Or how many have been on psychiatric drugs for copper toxic symptoms.
Yeah. It truly is a very remarkable screening tool. And, especially when you see others get better symptom wise, health wise, when you're based off of that, a hair test and then the correct supplements and correct food, the way of eating, it can really transform someone's health.
Absolutely, because health is based on nutrition,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
not
Yeah.
on patented drugs or patented vaccines or whatever else big pharma companies are peddling.
Yeah. Yeah. It takes time, but I feel like it's the most effective way to reverse symptoms.
And among all the lab tests, for most health issues, for most people, the hair analysis is primary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One time I was driving up to a Target store and looking at their logo with the big Target. I'm thinking, wow, the center of the target is the bullseye.
Mm-hmm.
Hair analysis is the lab test that hits the bullseye for most people. There's a lot of other test results that will give you different kinds of data that may hit the target, but they hit the outer rings of the target and you go round and round in circles. When you hit the bullseye, you have a much more accurate and valid set of test results.
Yeah. Yeah. Knowing what the body needs, I
Yeah,
think, is the missing piece to a lot of people who are searching for answers for their health. Like they'll do a mold test, they'll do a hormone test, like all
no,
these gut tests, but you're still not really seeing that picture of what you're deficient in, how your body
exactly.
is responding to stress, right? And the heavy metals, like kind of like those are the reasons why your body is not able to balance itself and get rid of all these unwanted visitors.
Yeah. Well, the concept of mineral balancing was a primary concept that Doctors Eck and Watts introduced 45. That the hair analysis shows what is deficient, what's out of balance with the ratios being too high or too low, and what needs to be done supplement-wise, diet-wise, to begin to replenish low minerals and balance mineral ratios that are out of balance.
Yeah. Yeah. It truly is an amazing tool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been saying for a long time, I think doctors should have gotten the Nobel Prize in medicine or healthcare, but that's not going to happen.
Yeah. I know.
But
It
but they came up with a phenomenal breakthrough in their hair analysis.
Yes, they did. And I know that it's helped a lot of people, and we're trying to get this, more known to more people, because it truly is to me, it's magical. It's like having a crystal ball.
Well, for me, it also was magical, which is why I'm still here.
Yeah. Yeah. What a blessing indeed.
Yeah.
Well, that's all the time we have today, Dr. Malter. Thank you so much for being on here with me.
It's been a
And
pleasure,
can
and
you
I always
share?
enjoy,
Oh, sorry, go
I
ahead.
always enjoy explaining hair analysis and my story and other stories that really validate it, but also to explain how strong the attacks have been on hair analysis
Yeah.
and the fact that it has cost the health mentally and physically for millions of people who could have benefited tremendously.
Yes. Can you tell the listeners where they can find you? Do you have a website, or how they can reach out to you if they
Well, they
wanted
can
to
find
chat with
me
you?
in my retirement home in Cottonwood, Arizona. And my website is malterinstitute.org. That's MALTER institute.org. And my email is rickmind, RICKMIND, the number 9 at Gmail.
And of course, they can get your books, right?
The Strands of Health off of Amazon. I've arranged to have Amazon print on demand. So when a person orders the book off of Amazon, it gets printed very quickly and sent out right away.
It's a
And
really
that
great
way,
read. So,
thank you.
all right. Thank you, everyone, for listening up to the end. And we'll see you again next week. Stay rebellious.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Rick. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please click the subscribe button, share it with others, post about it in social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from me or suggest topics, you can follow me on Instagram at Fatima Pagtakan or at The Wellness Rebel Show. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.